topics because my partner was unable to come this week. So instead of there being another gap week, we're just going to do the second part of this week next week instead of making the break even longer. So yeah, these are just the rules. Pretty sure everyone should be familiar with those. Also the eye goggles, I think, are confirmed by the head coaches that they will be providing them for each team. If you have eye goggles of your own, type B, or I think this is type C. So type C, bring them. But if you do not have them, then I don't think you need to worry because your team's head coaches should have them. Anyways, last meeting we went over qualitative analysis and paper chromatography. In this meeting, we're going to go over polymers, surface level polymers, not too much, crime scene physical evidence, which there is a lot in crime scene physical evidence, DNA, blood splatters, and a ton of other stuff, such as, if I try to remember, there's soil analysis tracks, but for this meeting, we're only going to go over fingerprints. There's also regular analysis, which um is just the end and how you're supposed to answer everything. But essentially, the remaining of the crime scene physical evidence will be dealt with next week. So this is going to be a pretty short meeting. Okay, so I'm going to talk about fiber analysis. There are three main types of fibers, and the three main types that you need to know, which are animal fibers, vegetable fibers, and synthetic fibers. So animal fibers are the basically anything that come from animals. So like wool from a sheep, goats, rabbits, llamas. These are all like animal fibers. Like fibers themselves, um, anything that can be used to make clothes or other items. It's like when you are in the lab, you would be asked to look at the clothing or accessories that some of the suspects have, and based on the fibers and the properties of those fibers, you might be able to make a prediction. So those are animal fibers. Vegetable fibers are stuff that comes from plants and crops. Obviously, the most common example is cotton. And then synthetic fibers are stuff that are artificially created through chemical synthesis. You might have heard of nylon, polyester, and acrylic. Those are all types of synthetic fibers. And we could go more about the properties, but there's you can also like conduct burn tests. So essentially animals fibers shrivel in heat while vegetable fibers just burn and synthetic fibers melt. So if you do try to make a burn test, that's the difference between those three fibers, which is also the easiest way of identifying it and possibly the best way of identifying it. And you don't need to know any other fibers other than these three types. And then there's hair analysis. So the only hairs that you need to know are the cats, dogs, and humans. Or those are the only ones that you're even allowed to look at. Um, best identified by looking at a microscope. So I will have a picture on this later, but the cuticle pattern right here, the cuticle is the outside here. Um, Essentially for dogs, it's like imbricate scales overlapping and slight variations depending on the breed. Essentially, there'll be a picture later to show it, but essentially it's like sort of like scales. I mean, that's what it says. But unlike cat's one where it's like a pattern, dog ones, it's just like it's not really a pattern, it's just sort of random. And there will be a picture later. And then human ones, they're typically imbricate, but they're less pronounced than human. So like there's not too many features. It's just a lot of these imbricate scales. And like yeah, we're talking about the cuticles here, the cortex and the medulla. You don't need to know them because they're inside the hair. But essentially, yeah, I don't know why there's a mouse hair here. You don't need to know mouse hairs. But the human hair, um, as you can see, the patterns like imbricate, the scales are like random. Dog, it's like a little bit more random, while cats actually have like a crown-like pattern going down. And then in diameter and thickness, for dogs, the hairs tend to have a wider variation in diameter, and this is due to guard hairs and undercoat hairs. It's overall smaller than human hair, much thinner. While cat hairs are like more consistent in diameter, and then they're often narrower than dog and human hairs. So cat hairs would be the thinnest, while the human hairs has the most consistent diameter and is more thicker than animal hairs. So human hair is the thickest, cat hair is the thinnest, um, dog hair is the middle uh, in terms of thickness, whereas consistency, human hair has most consistency than cat hair and dog hairs. And then we don't need to know mouse hairs. It was part of the picture. If it does help you, that's how mouse hairs look, or mice hair. You do not need to focus on that. And you, this is basically how you look at it through a microscope. So, yeah, that's essentially it. And then we'll move on to crime scene physical evidence. So, there are three main types of fingerprints: arches, whorls, and loops. So, arches are the most simplest and the most least common, or the least common fingerprint type. Just around 5% of the populations. So if you want, you can like look at your fingers and then try to see which type of fingerprint they are. But they have no deltas. So like they're all like straight, no deltas whatsoever, you can see. And then there's two types of arch fingerprints. There's the plain arch, which we see right here, where they just flow from one side to the other like a gentle wave. No sharp turns, no steep ridges. And a tented arch is essentially kind of like the same thing, but they have a sharp rise here, forming a peak that resembles a tent, and they just go back down. And some key features are that there's no circular or looped rigid transformations, and it all goes from one side to the other. So nothing's going to loop around. It's just one straight line from one side to the other. The next type are whorls, and this is the diagram for them. Whorls are more complex, and they're found in 30 to 35% of the population. They have at least one ridge that makes them a complete circuit, and they feature two deltas. So you can see, unlike the unlike the arch ones, which had no deltas, the whorls have like two deltas. And there are a couple types of whorls. You won't need to know all of them. You essentially need to know the plane whorl and the central pocket loop whorl, but it's also good to know about the other ones. So plane whorls are just ovals around a single core, just like you see right here. And the next one are central pocket loop whorls, and those ones are just kind of the same thing, but you won't see them particularly centered. And then, yeah, it kind of spirals around, and there's no rigid intersection between the two deltas. And then you get double loop whorl, which it looks like an S, and it's two distinct loops. So this is we'll talk about loops later, but this is one loop, that's another one, and then they create this, and this is categorized as a whirl. And then there's an accidental whirl, which is just you don't know what's going on, but it does have two deltas, and this would just be an accidental whirl. And then some key features, obviously it usually has two deltas, um, on either side of the circular patterns, like here, 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 and then here and here. I think for this one, there's one here, and that one's not one. It's just these two, and this one is like here and here. And then there's at least one ridge forms or a complete circle or spiral, which this is a complete circle, essentially a complete spiral. This is also essentially complete, and this it's accidental, so it doesn't have to follow the same rules as the other ones, but it sort of completes a circle. And the last type of fingerprint analysis are loops, and they're the most common type of fingerprint patterns. 60 to 65% of the populations, you most likely have this type of fingerprint, and they're essentially ridges that enter from one side, curve around, and they go back the same side they came from. So there's two types, the ulnar loop and the radial loop. They're sort of opposites. If you see right here what I was talking about, they go enter from one side, they curve around the finger, and then they exit out the same side. And here it's the same thing. They have one core and one delta, so here we can see the delta right here, and the core here. And the ridge curves and exits the same sides. So unlike an arch where it goes from this side to that side, a loop is just one side or the other. And the two types are ulnar and radial. So for ulnar, they enter and exit on the side closest to essentially the ulna, which is the forearm bone on the side of the pinky, which is hard to demonstrate, but it's the one near the pinky. And the radial one goes to the forearm bone on the side of the thumb. So there's different ones depending on which direction it's going towards. And these are both examples on the right thumb. And now that's a little bit on crime scene physical evidence. There's more that will be discussed next week, but right now I just want to talk about analysis. So the invitationals are not going to be until a while, January sometime. So you guys will probably know everything by the time invitationals, and you guys should probably know what we're going over right now. This is just for like those who are struggling behind. But the analysis is the final thing that you try to fill out in the lab. It's the conclusions. Everything that you've done in the lab give you suspects, and then you check through those suspects through different tests, through all these different things that you tested, like polymers, crime scene physical evidence, paper chromatography. And now finally you have to actually choose who is the victim. So, and then you'll get questions like who most likely perpetrated the caper, which if you actually know the context, then you'd know the caper is. Who most likely made tracks out of door one and door two. So it's not like a one person type thing. There could be multiple suspects for multiple different things. And then it's also like choose any one of the suspects that entered the room, and then mention his or her actions. I'll talk a little bit more about number five. Number five is basically based on like what you would think would happen based on what you know, and like some of the things you identified, it's not going to be exactly the same thing. Like, suppose fingerprints could be found, but they're not like exact half of them are like shaded, then something might have happened that caused that to happen, and then you need to put that in your analysis. And then you also get essentially that's the analysis, and this is one of the examples. And they basically case number doesn't matter, but they just talk about an incident. And when they talk about the suspects, it's not going to be hard code evidence. They're all suspects, and they all have like over here below their name. It's like student is often late to school, has numerous discipline referrals, most likely for disrupting class. These are like more evidence that you can use and stuff that you should use for stuff like number 5, where you're trying to list the actions that might happen. Like for this one, uh, missed last several meetings, grades are slipping. That could be one of the reasons. And then here, student has been quiet and reserved, no paperwork. It's all like about the personality of the person and what's going on. So that's essentially all the like information that you're given about the people for the analysis. Now, that's everything I have for you guys today. If you want to know what next week is going to be about, I'm not going to be here. Arav will have to present. It's going to be about DNAs, tracks like bike tracks, and then footprints, soil analysis, which are sand, silt, clay, and loam. And for soil analysis, unlike some other types of analysis, you can touch them. So it's a lot of feel and how they feel. There's spatters, blood spatters based on the angle and then stuff like that. And then that's essentially what's gonna be talked about next meeting. And then also in the same stretch, when go all the way to the beginning right here in the qualitative analysis, we're also gonna go over plastics, which we did go over mixed powder analysis, liquid analysis, and metal analysis. We're also going to go over plastics, which are also part of the paper I mean, not the paper chromatography, the qualitative analysis. So that's what's going to come next week. But that's everything there is this week. Um, do you have any questions? And the meeting will, yeah, the meeting will be recorded and uploaded.